You are now watching ZACIAN PTCG. Let's get it! Yo, what's poppin' peeps? Welcome back to my YouTube channel, ZACIAN. Today we're going to be covering over our power rankings, where I'm going to show you the top 10 decks, explain to you why they're the top 10 decks, and I'm going to provide all the deck lists below. Check the pinned comments. I'm also going to include videos that I've made on these decks, so if you're wondering what these decks are doing, I've recently cut those out of my videos. You can just check those videos yourself to see exactly what's going on, making this video more of a smooth transition. That being said, give this video a like to help boost the algorithm, really does help me out as a smaller YouTuber, and subscribe to the channel right here. We are so close to 4,000 subs, can't wait to get there. I really appreciate all the support from everyone along the way. That being said, let's see what makes up our top 10 decks this week and how they're going to change going into the end of this week. So I've explained a little bit about that, but let's see what's going on. Jumping into our number 10 spot, we have DRAGAFU VMAX, URSHIFU VMAX. Now, this is one of those decks where it did well at the beginning of the formats, and that was kind of in an experimental phase with the formats. And then people gradually split the deck into DRAGAFU VMAX decks, and then Rapid Strike URSHIFU VMAX decks. Rapid Strike URSHIFU VMAX did very well, while DRAGAFU VMAX fell off. So this is a really weird combination to come back at this stage in the metagame. I'm not sure if it's players that are just experimenting for the upcoming Players Cup 4 regional events, or if it's something that I'm missing entirely. I'd say that this deck, if anything, is going to fall off our top 10 completely. It was a fringe inclusion on our list. I'd say if anything, like the 11th, 12th spot decks like Altaria and Control have seen more of an overall impact, but based off of my ranking system, I did have to put this one at number 10. So like I said, I think this one's going to take a little bit of a nosedive, but I could be wrong. So do keep that in mind. I never expect to be perfect when it comes to these power rankings, but my gut feeling is telling me that this is just a 1 week occurrence of players testing, or a particular player, Jonathan Patricio, seeing a lot of success because they're a stronger player. I'd stay away from this one, but we'll see how it goes. Heading into our number 9 spot, we can see how far LUCMETAL has dropped down. This is due to increased competition from TEMPOZARD and from VICTINI VMAX. So when there's enough fire going around, it doesn't matter how many other VMAX decks are going to see success. It's one of those things where this deck is just going to get absolutely destroyed by fire. I personally tried out a version with 2 Stealthy Hoods and 4 Coating Metal Energies to help get around Giratina and the fire type weakness when it came down to this deck, and I utterly failed at the chill event going 3/3 drop. I've done everything I can to try to make this deck as fireproof as possible, so you can see that I've added a 4th Coating Metal Energy. So this is the version that I'd be playing if I were playing this deck in a metagame without fire. This is one of my favorite decks, if not my favorite deck in the current standard format, but I'd recommend to stay away from this deck at least until the fire type decks kind of tone down. I think that TEMPOZARD and VICTINI are both going to be strong heading into this week and future weeks, so it's one of those things where LUCMETAL might need to stay away a little bit. If you are a LUCMETAL diehard player, I recommend putting this deck off to the side for the foreseeable future, only for the purposes if we start starving the fire type decks of their really good matchup, their absolute best matchup that is, we can eventually come back to playing this deck. So if everyone stays away from LUCMETAL, this deck might see some success in the future. Jumping into our number 8 spot, we have Galaxy MEWTWO. Now this is a deck that was once towards the top, and it's trending downwards a little bit. I think it's because it has difficult matchups against other decks, just in general. I think with ETERN and PIKAROM doing really well, LUCMETAL on its way out, among with other things, I feel like TEMPOZARD probably has a bit of a favorable matchup here. It's one of those things where this deck can just struggle against the current meta right now. Still good enough to make the top 10 for sure. Doesn't necessarily have as many direct counters as LUCMETAL does, for example. So I'd say if anything, this deck's going to stay within the top 10, probably lower half, unless of course we see other decks that this deck would be successful against. Other decks would include lots of LUCMETAL, lots of what's the other deck here that I'm trying to think of? I'd say Rapid Strike URSHIFU, things like that. This deck doesn't necessarily have a lot of great matchups, but it is a pretty skill-based deck. Again, watch out for those E-turns and PIKAROMs, with those decks doing much better than this deck. I think it's one of those things where this deck's just doomed to stay within the lower half of the top 10 for the foreseeable future. But we'll see what next week brings. Jumping into our number 7 spot, we have Rapid Strike URSHIFU VMAX. Now this is a deck that won the Players Cup 3, so a lot of players have been playing it since then. I think the initial hype of this deck is wearing off a little bit, and as players are not necessarily inclined to be playing the new Battle Styles decks anymore, as they've done their exploring of this format, I think that this deck was a little bit overhyped compared to what it was, and that's for this particular format. That's not to say that this deck can't become better or worse or anything in the future, but I think that this deck is probably middle tier of the top 5, if that makes sense. So probably a 4, 5, 6, 7 if I ever had any kind of hunch with this deck. I don't necessarily think that this deck is going to be a number 1 deck before, because players have found ways to play around it, but depending on how matchups go in the future, this deck could definitely shoot up a little bit. Right now, with Pika and E-turn doing extremely well, I can see that this deck is tied in a correlation towards that. But with other decks like LUCMETAL and Galaxy MEWTWO still being in the format, that's of course going to anchor this one down to those middle tier spots. So we'll see how this week goes, but Rapid Strike URSHIFU seems like it's kind of cemented as the 4, 5, 6, 7 spot, if you had to ask me. Oh wow, how the mighty has fallen. Looking at our number 6 spot, we got ADP ZACIAN. Now, ADP ZACIAN being our number 1 spot for weeks, it seems like players are playing other decks. It might just be format boredom at this point. It's one of those things where ADP has very many neutral matchups, except it loses to E-turn for the most part. So just having good matchups across the board, or at least even matchups across the board, but struggles against E-turn. Can't really outplay your opponents too much with this deck. You could play this deck exceptionally well, but you can't really outplay your opponents. You could steamroll them, or you could just get steamrolled. You could play perfectly either way, but I think that's really where this deck's demise is going to be. I'd say if anything, this deck can shoot up as we still continue to explore this format. Players are probably going to be playing a bunch of weird things in the next upcoming weeks just to prepare for the Players Cup regional qualifiers and other events like the Team Challenge. That being said, I think that ADP typically does well against weird, so that I could just see ADP being a de facto deck choice for a lot of peeps. So I think that this deck, if anything, is probably going to get played a little bit more. I'd say that this deck is going to be a top 5 deck next week, or by the end of this week. Jumping in at our halfway point at number 5, we have Victini VMAX with Galarian Rapidash V. Not much really seeing change in this deck list. I've added a personal few techs here, cutting a Galarian Rapidash V, adding in a Cramorant V. Big things, reasons why, is just to diversify upon attacking options. Sometimes you don't want to be using Libra Horn, sometimes you don't want to be using Spit Shot, but sometimes they are the best option for any particular scenario. I do think Tool Jammer is a very welcomed inclusion into the deck, seeing if that can take off. One thing that worries me about this deck, it seems to be like ADP, except it has worse matchups across the board. That might just be me looking at this deck at a face value, or I might just be spitting hot takes. It's one of those, it's either or. But I played this deck at the Anti's weekly number 1. I was able to make phase 2 with it, but a lot of games it just feels like it's based off the coin flip, or you just lose to other decks. And that's really one of those things where sometimes this deck just loses. This deck has a very poor Temposard matchup, so in the discussion of Welder alone, this is not the best Welder deck. And if you can't play the best Welder deck, I recommend that you look into it a little bit more. Probably going to feature something on Temposard on my channel, but right now we're on Victini. I think this deck is still solid, but it's one of those things where I could probably fall down a little bit more. I'd say that this deck's probably going to be a 5, 6, 7, 8 inclusion on our next week, probably dropping a few spots, but we'll see how it goes. Jumping in to our number 4 spot, we have Eternatus VMAX. You can see this list got a little bit crispier, and it's a 2-line deck list. So, being super simple, basically, I got the cards for the LUCMETAL matchup. I don't think LUCMETAL's seeing enough play to warrant the Palpad and the Phoebe combination. So if you're one of those peeps that are running a Cynthia Caitlyn, Palpad, Phoebes, the Sableye V, I'd recommend cutting those for the foreseeable future. I think there's enough fire in our format to kind of help douse that LUCMETAL matchup for you. If you do run into one, you want to know what? You try your best with Crobat V, and if all else fails, you just lose the matchup. Again, a lot of the players who are going to be playing LUCMETAL right now are probably going to lose to those fire decks, or they might be players who are crazy enough to play it regardless, and that might mean that their skill level might be a little bit lower. I was one of those players, and I definitely got punished for it by the fire type decks. In the future, if LUCMETAL and other poor matches where Phoebe and Palpad could be doing really well help you out, add those back into your deck. See how it goes. I added a power plant. Grass MEWTWO is a little bit all over the place right now, so it's one of those things where power plant is helpful against their Wondrous Lab. And I was considering running a Chaotic Swell, but for the sake of it, I think power plant might be a little bit better. I'd really like to add a second one into this deck. Not entirely sure how I'm going to get there, but we'll see how it eventually goes. Jumping into our number 3 spot, we have Grass MEWTWO, and whether this deck is focusing on the Rowlet Alolan Executor double version or the Mewtwo and Mew GX version, it's one of those things where this deck is seeing a lot of success. So the biggest question is why? This deck has what seems to be a poor matchup against Etern. I think it goes close against Pika. I think it goes close against a lot of decks. But it seems to see success in other ways where Dex does not. I can't necessarily put my finger on it, but Grass MEWTWO just seems like the best way to be playing Mewtwo right now. I mean, again, we haven't seen PIKAROM on this list so far, surprise, surprise. It's probably out there, but it's one of those things where in terms of a traditional Mewtwo deck where you're copying things such as Incineroar GX, Dragonite GX, Buzzmosa, Vileplume GX, Rowegg, things like that, this deck seems to have enough tricks up its sleeve, and I think it's one of those things where this deck has tricks up its sleeve. It's a little bit more of a mysterious deck, and the reason why I'm saying it's a mysterious deck, not a lot of players know exactly what's going on with this deck when they're playing against it. Myself included, I've played this deck a handful of times, I've made videos on this deck. It's one of those things, I need to learn this deck a little bit more so I can fully understand its matchup spread, because it does a lot of surprising and cool things. And I guess healing damage and having different attacking options is always going to be a strong choice. So maybe this deck's all about the options. I'd say that this deck's going to stay within the top 5 if you had to ask me. Jumping in to our number 2 spot, we got TEMPOZARD. Now, TEMPOZARD here is absolutely fire, gaining the new Galarian Rapidash V-Tech, so you could use Librahorn to bring things down, similar to what we saw in the Victini VMAX deck list, doing the 1 Cramorant V, 1 Galarian Rapidash V split. I think having more options of attacks is usually included in better decks. It's a trend that we see a lot. The more niche plays that you can make gives yourselves more opportunities to dig yourself out of holes that your opponents create for you. This deck really seems like it's well positioned. I don't necessarily like this deck in Best of 1, but when we're getting ready for the Players' Cup 4 and Team Challenge, Best of 3 format major events, I think that this is one of those things where this deck should be more successful in those events than it is in Best of 1, and it's still seeing success in Best of 1, which means that this is probably a very good choice going forward. So I plan on updating this deck on my channel really soon. I haven't necessarily covered this one in a minute, or I haven't necessarily even covered more of a... I've covered like Blacephalon versions, Blacephalon Victini. I don't feel like I've covered an actual like TEMPOZARD video in a hot minute. So, or ever, we'll see. It's one of those things where it's all very similar because it's Jirachi, Blacephalon, Fire, Welder-based attackers. But I do plan on covering this week, so stay tuned for that. If anything, I think that this deck is going to stay within the top 5, top 3. I think it's just really good right now. So jumping into our number 1 spot, we have PIKAROM. And I think PIKAROM won this whole week because it is the most neutral deck. It is, when it's played by top players, there's handfuls of avenues that you could take in the game. And cards like Crushing Hammer, Marnie, Reset Stamp, Big Charm, Chaotic Swell, like I could go on and on, mix that with Paralysis, mix that with whatever. This deck seems to have it all. This is the deck that I won the Players' Cup 2 with. I mean, this deck came second at the Players' Cup 3. If we want to choose a horse to bet on, this is the one that we should bet on. And that's not to say that it's always going to be the best deck for the foreseeable future, But until this deck gets at least rotated out of the formats, Pikachu and ZACIAN should always be in the conversation. Now, this is a deck that, I mean, when you're at the number 1 spot, decks are probably going to try to take you down. Do I think Rapid Strike URSHIFU is well positioned right now? Yeah, probably. Etern, I think, was like top 4. We got the whole TEMPOZARD, and we have this deck. I mean, that would make Rapid Strike URSHIFU poised to go up. That might make LUCMETAL poised to go up. PIKAROM's in a unique situation where right now it's fairly neutral against most decks. People are still learning how to play PIKAROM successfully, so PIKAROM is probably going to see more success in the future. Maybe not to this level, but this is a deck that I think is definitely a top 3 deck, at least a top 5 deck for the foreseeable future, so let's keep it that way. Give this deck a try if you haven't already. It's another one of these decks that I plan on updating on my channel real soon to get everyone prepared for the PC4. That being said, I think this one's truly a champion deck. And that's a wrap. Hopefully you enjoyed our top 10 decks. If you want to know anything going on about other decks that may not have been featured in this video, or if you want a little bit of clarification on something, feel free to let me know in the comments below. While you're there, give this video a like. I say it every video, but I truly mean it. It does really help boost our algorithm. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video, or if you haven't subscribed. I mean, you wanna know what? There's times where I've had friends who are like, you wanna know what? I have watched your channel for months. I never knew that I wasn't subscribed. Check it out, see if you're subscribed, get us closer to that 4,000 subs. That being said, I'm excited to see what this week has in content. I'm feeling a lot more rejuvenated, refreshed, taking a little bit of time off, and now I'm excited to create some exciting content. What a wordplay I have going on there. That being said, I gotta go edit this video. Got a bunch of cool things. Hopefully everyone liked the new decorations that I have going on. But we'll catch up with everyone real soon. Have yourself a wonderful week. Peace out. I want to give a huge shout out to everyone who's become a channel member so far. Some peeps love watching my videos, and I totally appreciate that, but some peeps have gone more than out of their way beyond just watching my videos and have supported me financially. So shout out to everyone who's been featured on this channel, who's going through this list of names. We actually have so many channel members that I can't fit them in a single slide, so I figured this might be the best way to get everyone appreciated and kind of showcase all of the top supporters of the ZACIAN PTCG YouTube channel. Seriously, it means I mean it from the bottom of my heart. It's honestly, I'm almost at a loss for words, but I'm so happy that you are all appreciating and loving the content and that it's hitting home. And I mean, I'm up all in my feels, so I hope that you understand. And thank you so much, everyone. If you want to become a channel member, totally consider it. I'll make it worth your while. And I totally mean that. I'll do everything I possibly can for my channel members to make it sure that it's worth their while. So thank you so much, everyone, and it's just amazing. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. If you haven't already, it'd mean the world to me if you could subscribe to help support me as a content creator. Thanks again, and have yourself a great one.